One of the most useful tools for any journalist looking to work with data is a lookup formula. A lookup formula allows you to fetch some extra data that complements or adds some extra context to some data that you already have. So for example, quite often we might have data on the number of crimes, but we need to fetch the actual population to put that into context. Or we might want to get some historical data to see whether numbers are going up or down. In this video I'm going to walk through exactly how to write a lookup formula and some common situations where you might want to do that. And I'm going to use this gender pay gap data. It's one of my favourite data sets. There's a lot of things you can do with it, and one of the things that it's very good for is lookup formulas, because there are lots of pieces of information here that we can use to fetch extra data that's related to the data that we have here, and that's what I'm going to do. So the first thing to mention is that before you write a lookup formula, you need to make sure that you have all the data that you need in the same spreadsheet. So in this spreadsheet I've got the gender pay gap for the latest year, and the first thing I'm going to fetch is some historical data. So I'm going to fetch the gender pay gap for a previous year. I'm also going to fetch some information on industry codes and postcode populations. So I've got all that data in the same spreadsheet. You can see I've got 5 sheets across the bottom. But we're just going to work through each of those in turn, and I'm going to start with historical data. We've got here a data set of the gender pay gap for each of these companies in the latest year, and this is the column here, and I've renamed this column as well. I've specified that it's the gender pay gap for 24-25, which it doesn't in the original data. And the reason for that is that I'm going to end up with another column that also tells me the difference in the gender pay gap, how big the gender pay gap is, and I want to make sure that they are easy to distinguish. So that's what I want to bring in, and in order to do that, in order to write a lookup formula, you need something to look up. In other words, we need there to be a piece of information about each of these companies that is in both sheets of data. And there are a couple of obvious candidates here. The name of the employer is one thing we could look up. We could look for British Airways PLC in this data here, and we can see it here on row 1408. We could also look for the employer ID, and we also have a company number column as well. So any one of these could be used to look up the employer in the other data set. And I'm going to use the ID number for each employee. I can just check that that's consistent, so 549 for British Airways PLC. I can see it's also 549 in this data set, so that ID does seem to be consistent. Codes are always better to look up with because names can be typed slightly differently, there can be slight variations, or indeed companies can change names in this case. So ID codes are always going to be the better option if you have them. So to create my lookup, I'm going to create a new column, and this is where I'm going to have the old pay gap. So we want the mean pay gap in 2022 to 23, and we're going to need to type a formula in each of these cells that looks for this ID code in this data set, and then it's going to go and fetch whatever's in this column, column G, where the mean pay gap for that year was recorded. So let's do that. I'll do this quickly first, just so you can see the process, and then I'll explain the formula that I've just written. So let's write the formula quickly. Because it's a formula, it starts with equals. We're going to use a function called XLOOKUP. Because it's a function, there's always a bracket after it, and that contains the ingredients of this function. And again, I'm going to do this relatively quickly to begin with, and I'm going to slow it down. So we're going to look for this ID, and we're going to look in this sheet in column B, and we want to fetch back what's in column G. Close the brackets, press enter, and it's fetched what appears to be the pay gap for this company, British Airways PLC. 57 is the pay gap, and we can just manually check that. Here's British Airways PLC, and we can see there it is, 57 is the pay gap. So let's do that again a little bit more slowly for the next company. We're not going to have to type this 10,000 times, we're just going to copy the formula once we're happy that it's working, but I'm going to do it a second slow time. So again, we start a formula, any formula, with the equal sign, and the lookup function that we're going to use is called XLOOKUP, and as you type it you should see it coming up in the little hint box below. Because it's a function, we open some brackets afterwards to give it the ingredients, and this function needs 3 ingredients. It needs to know what it's looking up, so the ID code, in other words what's going to be what you're going to find a match for in the other data set. So we're looking for this. Then you put a comma to move on to the next ingredient. And this is the trickiest bit in the process because you have to switch to another sheet. Now, as you do that, you're obviously going to lose this cell where you're typing the formula. But notice that the formula that you're typing is also up here in the formula bar. So that's where we're going to carry on typing this formula. Make sure you've put the comma first, but watch this formula bar up here as you switch to the next sheet where you're looking for this code. So you should see that that formula up in the formula bar has now added the name of the sheet and an exclamation mark. So that's basically a way of describing a path to this sheet. It's saying look for the value in B3 and look for it in a sheet called GPG 2022 to 23, and when I click on the B column or the B letter, it's going to put in B:B. So put another way, what that means is look for the value from B3 in a sheet called GPG 22 to 23 in the column B. So that's the second ingredient of the formula that tells us where we are looking for a match on the value in B3. The final ingredient, and at this point I have to put a comma to move on to that third and final ingredient. The final ingredient is, okay, if you find a match, what do you want to bring back? Because we don't want to bring back the ID code, we've already got that. We want something else here. So that's where we move to column G, and we specify that what we want to bring back is whatever's in column G at the same position. So if I click on column G, then again it will fill in that final ingredient, not just with G:G to indicate that column, but also the sheet that that column is in, because it's different to where we were typing our formula. That's the final ingredient, so we can now close the brackets, and as soon as we press enter, we're going to get taken back to where we typed that formula. And again, that seems to have worked. Next Retail Limited, we can look for them, 27.8. We can do a quick search, and we can see that 27.8 was indeed the pay gap for that company. So that's one example of how you might use a lookup formula. We've got the current numbers and we want to fetch a previous year's numbers as well in order to work out whether the numbers are going up or down whether things are getting better or worse. Once we're confident that those two lookups, or even just one lookup, has worked, we can then start to copy it down the whole column. And the quickest way to do that is to select the bottommost formula, hover over the bottom right corner of that, and when you get the black cross, double click. As long as the column to the left is completely full, and this goes all the way down to the last row. I've only got 70 rows here just for demonstrating. Then we can get the whole column populated with these lookups, and you'll see that the cell reference in each, this one's looking in B47, the next one is looking in B48, and so on. But because we've specified the whole column, B and G, that never changes. So that's our first lookup, looking up historical data. As you'll have seen, that's quite a complex formula. It's one of the more complex formulas or functions in Excel or in Google Sheets. Don't worry about kind of memorizing how the whole function or formula works. Just keep looking it up, and the more you use it, the less you'll need to look it up, but it is quite common to keep looking it up each time. But that's the looking up the historical data. We can now make a calculation, so we could say, you know, change since 22-23, and that would simply be equals the most recent figure subtract the older figure. And so we can see for British Airways it's gone down 3%, so from 57 a couple of years ago to 54 recently. And again, we can copy that all the way down to see that most of these companies have seen a drop in their gender pay gap, but there are some that have seen it rise. This one's gone up by 2%, this one's gone up by 2.5%, and so on. But you'd need to use that lookup in order to fetch that data in to do that calculation. So a second example of where you might use this is you've got some category codes. So we've got some industry codes here, SIC codes. Each one of these represents a different sector of industry. Not all companies have got them, so in these cases there's no codes at all, or it's just the number one, which isn't a code. But what we want to do is know what that code means, and I've gone off and I've found a reference list of what each of these codes means. So for example, 10110 means processing and preserving of meat. What about if I wanted to create a column of text versions of these codes, so something a bit more meaningful? So again, I could do that. I could insert a new column, and I could call this SIC lookup, and the process is the same. So I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. I'm going equals XLOOKUP, open brackets. I'm looking for this code, and I put the comma in before I switch the sheet. Now I'm going to go to my table of all the codes and what they mean. The first thing I select is the column containing the codes themselves, the thing that I'm looking for. So I'm looking for the codes in this column. Then I press another comma, and then what I want to bring back, which is this description column here, column D. Close the brackets, and now we can see British Airways is scheduled passenger air transport. That's the category, and I can copy that all the way down. So we've got quite a few banks here, we've got higher education, and so on. So this is a bit more meaningful than the codes that we had before. That's the second reason you might want to use a lookup. And this means I can do a pivot table on this, and it will be a bit more meaningful than pivoting on the codes alone. Now I could repeat this again, and I could fetch the general section, so I could aggregate all of these codes as just manufacturing. That's another thing I could do as well, but I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to move on to the postcode this time, and what I've done with a full data set is I've pivoted on that postcode district. So what this is telling me is how many companies there are in each postcode district. And to put that into context, I've got the population of each postcode district. I've taken it from Wikipedia, which takes it from the 2011 census. It's always good to include the source of the data alongside the information that you're using here. But I want to know, okay, there's 73 companies in this data in postcode AB, which is Aberdeen. How many companies is that per person? And to do that, I've created another lookup formula. And once again, it's going to look for this code. It's going to look in this sheet, pops by postcode, lookup, in column A, and it's going to bring back what's in column C. Now, when you do this in a pivot table, there's a reason I'm showing you this pivot table, and that's because something can happen if you try it a slightly different way. If I do it for AL, now you'll notice that when I click on this cell here, I won't actually get A5 necessarily in the formula. What I'll get sometimes is a whole bunch of gobbledygook around pivot tables. Now in this case it actually has put A5 bizarrely, but just watch out for that. Just type the cell reference instead of clicking on the cell itself when you're using pivot tables, because you can get these very specific references that don't change when you copy it down. So if you're using pivot tables, always type the cell reference, and again we're going to look for it in this sheet, column A, type a comma, and I want to bring back the population. Close the brackets, press enter, and now we can copy it down. So that just gives us some context for each area. We can now work out, okay, how many companies. Here we go, this is what I was talking about earlier. So if you see something like this, then replace that with the cell reference. So it'll be 4 divided by this number here. And again, the reason I'm typing B4 is because I want that cell reference to change as I copy this formula. If I get something other than a cell reference, it's not necessarily going to change. So this is companies per person, and now this starts to put that into context more generally. So instead of just saying, okay, this postcode has the most companies, I can say this postcode has the most companies per person. And because it's such a small number, I'm also going to need to multiply it by 1,000 or something like that to get per 1,000 people, or let's try per million people, maybe 10,000. There we go, per 10,000, that looks okay. And again, we can copy that down. So we can see that despite having fewer companies, actually AL has got more per person, and so has CB. Now at this point we might want to add another lookup to find out, okay, what is AB and AL and so on. So we're going to do exactly the same, but this time we're going to bring back what's in column B. And it turns out St Albans is AL and Cambridge is CB. So that's a quick tour of the XLOOKUP formula. I just want to show you one final example to demonstrate something else about this, which is how you might use it to look up context for ethnicity, and also when you get errors. So I've got here the number of stops and searches made by ethnic group. Not surprisingly, the top ranking group is white people, but white people are also the largest section of the population, so that's not surprising. What we're more interested in is that as big a proportion as we would expect, given how big a section of the population white people are in this particular police force. So I've gone off and found population data about each region. I've got the source there, and I'm going to do a lookup between these two. So it's going to be XLOOKUP again. I'm going to look for that term. I'm going to look for it in this column, and I want to bring back the West Midlands population. But I'm going to get an error when I press enter at the end, and if I copy this down, I'm going to get errors for all of these apart from white. And the reason for this is that the matches aren't exact. You'll remember earlier I said that ID codes are always better, so if we had an ID code for each category here in both data sets, that would be much better to match on. But in this case, we've only got the words, and these naming conventions are different for each category apart from white. So for this to work, I would have to make sure that the two match up, and one simple way to do this is to copy the terms across. So if I copy Asian across, you'll see now, because it's the exact same string of characters, that lookup now works. And actually, quite often when you're doing these lookups, you might find that it matches 90% of your rows, and you might have just 10% of your rows that don't match, quite often because of things like slightly different characters, or you might have one data set that says City of Bristol and the other one says Bristol City of. Small differences like that can break individual lookups, and what you would do is just clean up the two data sets where they don't match to just make sure that the terms do match, and then the lookups should start to work. So that's the final point on lookups, but as I said, a really useful function to be aware of and to practice and to use. It allows you to bring in all sorts of extra context to your data, historical context, population context, converting codes into plain English, things like that, and it really helps you tell stronger stories, find better stories, and tell them more accurately.